Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to be looking at the TCP three-way handshake. Alright, now this is very important to understand how the connection process or how a connection is established using the TCP or the transmission control protocol. Alright, so let's get started and I hope you're ready because it's really exciting. Alright, so the first thing you might be asking yourself is what exactly is a three-way handshake? Well, a three-way handshake is a method that is used in the TCP/IP or the transmission control protocol / internet protocol network to create a connection between a local host and a client and a server. Alright, now your server could be your target depending on whether or not you're performing a scan, but we'll be getting into that. Now, as I said, one of the most important things that is included in the TCP header are the TCP flags. Alright, so the TCP flags are used to indicate the type of packet that is being sent. Now let's look at the TCP flags. This is very important because we'll be looking at this a lot when it comes down to Nmap. Alright, so the first TCP flag we have is the urge or the urgent, alright, and you then have your ACK, which is for acknowledge. You have your push, which is denoted by PSH. You have your RST, which is reset, SYN, which is synchronize, and you have your FIN, which is finish. They are all used to indicate the type of packet that is being sent. Right, and you'll understand this when we'll be looking at at how the TCP session is created and how the connection is established using the three-way handshake. All right, so let's look at that right now. All right, so here I have a diagram that is simply explaining the connection between a client and a server. All right, so essentially what's happening is the client initiates the connection by sending a packet to the server with the SYN. All right, the SYN is the synchronized packet. All right, so it's sending a SYN flag. So it's gonna send a packet to the server with the SYN flag. Alright, so the SYN flag is going to tell the server that the client is attempting to establish a connection. So essentially what's happening is the client is going to send a packet to the server with the SYN flag. Alright, so it's saying, it's essentially the purpose of this is it's telling the server that, hey, I want to establish a connection with you. Alright, so the server will then respond to the client with a packet that has both the acknowledge and the synchronize flags. Alright, so ACK is short for acknowledge. So essentially the server will respond to the client with a packet that has both the ACK or the acknowledge and the SYN flags. Alright, so essentially what's happening here is the server is going to send this packet with the two flags, the synchronize and the acknowledge flags. And what this means is that the server is acknowledging the connection. Alright, so then the client then receives the SYN and ACK flags and sends a packet back to the server with the acknowledge flag, essentially acknowledging the connection. And once that is complete, a TCP socket connection is established. Alright, so let me explain that really simply. Alright, so let's say you wanted to connect to a server. Alright, now the first thing you would do is you would send them a packet with the SYN flag. So you essentially what you're telling them is, hey, I want to connect to you. Alright, so you're sending them a synchronize flag. The server will then respond to you with the acknowledge and the synchronize flag, with a packet with the acknowledge and the synchronize flag, saying, okay, we can connect to each other. Alright, you then receive the synchronize and the acknowledge packet, that you receive the packet that contains the synchronize and the acknowledge flags, and you send back to the server an acknowledge packet that contains the acknowledgement flag, essentially acknowledging the connection, and a connection is created or completed. Alright, so moving on to to a simple diagram that I have here. I'm not sure you can read it. If you can just look at how the connection goes through here. This is also a very good way of understanding how the three-way handshake works when it comes down to TCP. Showing you how a connection is established between a connection and a server. Alright, so I hope this was a very simple way of me essentially explaining to you, and you've understood how the three-way handshake works, because it is very important, especially given the TCP flags, because we'll be looking at actually using them when we'll be working with Nmap. Alright, so that was how the three-way handshake works and how a connection is established using the TCP/IP. Alright, so that's going to be it for this lecture, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.